Well, hello, and welcome to the second thematic session dedicated to climate resilient PPPs and how to promote them. My name is Oscar Berger, and I'll be the moderator. I'm the Executive Director for LTIIA, the Long-Term Infrastructure Investor Association, an association gathering institutional investors from the asset owner side, also called as limited partners, such as life insurance companies, pension funds, retirement systems, or foundations, and asset managers, general partners, such as specialized investment funds, all sharing the same long-term DNA, an interest in sustainable infrastructure, and collectively managing around $350 billion of assets in unlisted infrastructure, mostly equity. And as such, we can be viewed as representing the private financing side of infrastructure projects, PPPs in the broader sense of the term, even though we also count some public institutions and try to act as a bridge to connect public and private long-term investors in pursuit of sustainable infrastructure assets. So that's basically the reason why we wanted to involve ourselves in this event and more specifically sponsor and moderate this panel about resilient PPPs. Now, before we introduce the panelists, I'd like to briefly set the scene for our upcoming discussion. And a lot of it's already been said by the previous panels. Basically, a few reminders. Climate mitigation financing is not sufficient by far, even if the Paris Agreement goals were to be met, which is increasingly doubtful, and some of the previous speakers spoke to that. We need to adapt economic and social assets, starting with infrastructure, to new climate conditions. Infrastructure systems are vulnerable to extreme weather events, as they are often organized as complex networks where even small local shocks can generate wide disruption. Enhancing sustainable infrastructure is therefore one of today's great challenges, and huge costs are involved in driving this shift to increased resilience. We heard from the previous speaker from CPI and S&P about the financial flows currently observed. One very clear lesson is that not enough overall is going to climate change investment, and within that insufficient flow, much less is going to adaptation or resilience as opposed to mitigation. So a huge infrastructure financing gap when it comes to adaptation, with mostly public financing involved so far. But as we all know, this financing is under growing budgets and fiscal constraints, particularly in emerging markets, which are among the most affected by climate change, as evidenced by a number of recent reports. So private financing is definitely at the order of the day required, even though we're starting from a negligible level today. Hence, I believe, a very relevant and to the point theme we're going to discuss today. Let me just add that we'll also conduct 3 flash polls during the session to get the views of the audience. And of course, you will be invited to contribute or ask questions, whether through chat or directly during the last part of the session. So let me now turn to our panelists, and I will ask each of them to introduce her or himself in 2 minutes maximum, so that we reserve as much time as possible to the conversation. Ladies first. Jennifer, if you want to start.
Hi, François, and thank you for having me. It's great to speak and bring the water perspective to the panel. So myself, I'm a water economist by training. I've been specializing in water risk assessments, first with a think tank, mostly working on EU projects, then with PwC, looking at corporate water risks, and then working with the World Bank and UN, really understanding the water risks for countries, regions, and cities, to then identify the underlying causes, to then actually find solutions, one of which, of course, can be PPPs, and to create a sustainable environment, right? I also have created a crash course on how to assess water risks and a 12-week training. And you asked me to quickly state my view on climate resilience. There's a very nice quote called, "If climate change is a shark, then water is its teeth," by James P. Bruce, meaning that the fish only notices the shark when it's actually being bitten by the sharp teeth. And the same thing we can translate to climate change, that we only know about climate change, we only feel it when actually we're noticing, and we notice it through water mostly. Floods, droughts, and a whole area of things which we all know about. So for me, the important thing of climate resilience is to always look at water risks and to address the underlying challenges of water risks, not just the ones we see on the surface, to really become resilient.
Thank you for this very graphic image. And indeed, water is at the heart of many of physical climate risk, and we'll get back to that in a moment. Munir, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you very much, Francois. First of all, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here to talk about a topic which is very close to our heart, both personally and professionally. My name is Munir Ferozi. I look after IFC's PPP transaction advisory business for Middle East, Central Asia, Turkey, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. IFC is part of the World Bank Group. And the business that we cover is both investment and advisory. And the business that I cover is providing advice to the government in terms of developing PPPs through private sector participation, both in the hardcore infrastructure space, as well as the social infrastructure space. Let me, Francois, you actually put a good context, but I want to maybe just add a couple of things to that from my perspective. First of all, as we know, the global warming target to keep it below, at 1.5 degrees centigrade will require huge efforts. And as you said, that we may not be able to even reach that unless we are very intentional about both mitigation and adaptation. And infrastructure as an asset class provides or is responsible for 79% of all GHG emissions. So I think it's extremely important for us to really think ex ante in terms of development of this infrastructure. How do we make it climate resilient? How do we do both adaptation and mitigation? And I think I would like to submit that even with these ambitious measures, the climate hazard that we've seen recently, droughts, rainfall, floods, have impacted and will continue to impact the infrastructure. So that has an impact in terms of the investor appetite and really the financing of this, and how we as sort of financiers, investors, lenders, and sort of the PPP ecosystem, how do we basically adapt to that will be very important. I look forward to discussing that. Last point from my side, I think MDBs have been a pioneer in this, MDBs such as IFC, and I think we have a very key role to play, particularly because we operate more in the emerging markets, where if you look at the last 20 years, 7 out of 10 most impacted countries are in the sort of emerging economies. So it is extremely important for us to really be intentional about it, and I look forward to our discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Munir, and we'll revisit this specific role or responsibility that MDBs have in that respect. Mahesh, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all. I am Mahesh Arare. I represent World Resources Institute in India. I am currently their program head working on climate action plan in cities in Maharashtra state in India. My background is I'm basically civil engineer and urban planner, and I'm working in urban sector consulting field for last 17 years. I also worked with the one of the flagship program of Rockefeller Foundation, that is 100 Resilient Cities Network, where I was Chief Resilience Officer for Pune City. And considering the current situation, I think this is opportune time to basically look at both adaptation and mitigation closely across the globe, because different countries, different regions have their different priorities and different characteristics. For example, in case of Indian cities, it's a completely different characteristic compared to the European and US cities. So one need to look at in a different way to those cities. Over to you, Frank.
Thank you, Mahesh. Let me now turn to Salim to introduce himself.
Hello.
Salim, you may be on mute.
Hello? Okay, sorry, something wasn't working. So my name is Salim Ben-Smail. I'm a senior investment director at Meridium. Meridium is a leading infrastructure impact investment firm. We're headquartered in Paris, but we have offices in nine locations across Europe, Africa, and North America. We have 18 billion euros of assets under management, which effectively are supporting a total capital expenditure investments of about 70 billion euros across our investments. Our focus is exclusively on the development of greenfield infrastructure, with projects across three main impact areas. We invest in critical public services, sustainable mobility, and low carbon solutions. My personal background has mostly been in the French public sector. I was working on infrastructure with Treasury and with the city of Paris for 8 years. And I joined Meridium 9 months ago to co-lead a new initiative that Meridium has launched in partnership with the Rockefeller Foundation and the United Nations Capital Development Fund, which is an initiative that aims to support and accelerate the delivery of urban resilience projects in cities. So the angle, I guess, that I'll be bringing today to the conversation around climate adaptation is the critical role of cities that cities play in the climate change agenda. Cities are responsible for 70% of global CO2 emissions, and this will only get worse in the sense that population in cities is expected to grow by over 2.5 billion people by 2050. And also, urban areas are the most vulnerable to the risks associated with global warming. So we really believe that the urban question is at the center of the climate adaptation agenda, and I'll be speaking to you about why we think that private investors and long-term investors such as Meridium have an important role to play in delivering on the climate adaptation agenda.
Thank you, Salim. Indeed, you're the representative of the private sector in a way, at least the private investment funds in this panel. So as you can see, we have assembled a wonderful panel, high-level senior specialists hailing from different sectoral and regional backgrounds to help us address this discussion. We'll now, without further ado, delve into the first round of questions. And this will sort of focus on the more sort of physical challenges, physical issues linked with climate risk, whether it's about capacity or knowledge gaps, the various drivers for resilience that can be identified and implemented from the public and the private side. But first, let's go to our first flash poll. So let me ask our organizers maybe to display the main questions, and you have, I believe, 1 minute to go through it. Should be very easily done by just clicking on each of the corresponding bullet points. So rank them by order of importance as you see them. What are the main issues, the main challenges faced by investors, whether public or private, willing to engage into PPP projects in resilient infrastructure when it comes to access to data and methodological issues? Okay, so maybe we'll give another 10-15 seconds, and then we'll proceed to to launch the discussion. This will be commented in the course of our exchange, but already we can see that lack of relevant granular data features prominently at the same level as the lack of dedicated specialized expertise and to a lesser degree the lack of relevant case studies to inspire or be replicated by investors willing to engage into resilient PPPs. Now, my first question is for Mahesh. So you mentioned it in your introduction, Mahesh. Mumbai was the first city in India to adopt a climate action plan with incorporating this adaptation or resilience dimension, not just mitigation. Could you give us, maybe from your Mumbai experience, a broad view of the urban challenges based on the lessons from your Mumbai background and the way you rolled out this climate action plan? How much private money you effectively managed or expect to leverage, and more broadly, how can cities ready themselves for such a drastic shift on policy and development? Over to you, Mahesh.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I will share our experience, WRI's experience on working on the climate action plan for Mumbai city. And I will also highlight some of the challenges, especially focusing on urbanization and typical in Indian cities, what we look for and what are the challenges there. So as we know, India is urbanizing rapidly. Almost 34% of the population lives in urban areas. If you look at 2017 as a base year, and it is expected that almost 41% will live in urban areas by 2030. So it's rapidly increasing. At the same time, what is happening is it is creating pressure on the water resources, housing, and same is applicable with Mumbai city as well. If you look at Mumbai, it is one of the most populous city in India and also globally. If you look at the population, 2011 census population, it was around 12.44 million, probably one of the biggest cities in the world. And even the density is also very high, almost like 28,000 person per square kilometer. But it holds, although the population is very high, if you look at the composition of the population, the slum population is almost like 55%. But they have a major contribution to the city's economy. The city is known as financial hub of the India. But a lot of these people are employed in the informal sector. So you can look at that as a gray area where they are living in slum areas where they may not have access to proper housing, proper services, but at the same time, they are contributing to the GDP and the overall economy of the country. And they are also the vulnerable sections of the society if you look at the climate risk or hazard in that. The similar situation is there in other Indian cities as well. If you look at the demographic pattern, the slum population ranges from 15 to 50%, and sometimes it is even higher at 60%. Since India is a diverse country, so many cities face different challenges depending on their geographic location. Mumbai is a coastal city which faces two major challenges. One is urban flooding and increasing heat. Since it's a coastal city, there is high level of humidity and also resulting humid heat. Plus, it has also different climate-related risks like storm surge, coastal inundation, and also sea intrusion. So a lot of these are there. Some are due to the geographical condition of the city, because city was created by reclaiming land between 7 separate islands. And if you look at the mean sea level, it is around 0.01 meter. So one side there is high population density, tremendous population growth happening. It's a financial capital. At the same time, there is a slum population which is living in substandard areas or substandard housing conditions, and also have limited access to various services and finance. So when you look at urban heat as one of the major risks in case of a Mumbai, you can clearly see that this is the vulnerable section of the society, especially low-income households and informal settlement, which are at a higher risk. They have limited access to water, limited sanitation facilities, and the nature of their living environment. For example, they are living in metal roofs, so which is also creating a major issue there, creating a major challenge. So when we were doing a climate action plan for Mumbai city, we looked at two aspects. One is adaptation and other is the mitigation aspect. So in the vulnerability assessment, we looked at all these aspects. We had a GIS mapping done for the entire city. We looked at the census data since that was the comprehensive data available, but that was dated almost like 2011 data. We also got lot of information from Mumbai Corporation because they had that kind of a data available with them, but still it was not that up to date. So data is a major challenge that I will highlight later on. Even during the poll, we could look at one of the areas, that is the granular data is not available. When we look at the climate risk, some of these communities which are increasingly exposed to the dangers of air pollution or even the other aspects. If you look at air pollution, it is increasing due to the traffic congestion, unregulated construction activities, and mismanagement of solid waste as well. So a lot of these housing demand related issues, construction activities happening, a lot of infrastructure happening, infrastructure development happening, because of which there is wind blown dust, which is also causing a lot of pollution also in the cities. So in this regard, we also looked at access to the services and mapped them in terms of vulnerability, because that kind of information, if available with the city can actually work around that. Even the private sector can look at that aspect, especially during the disasters. In terms of drinking water, I just highlight some of the numbers. Almost 94% of the households within Mumbai city have access to water, but only 60% have access to sanitation. So you can imagine during the disasters or even during the flooding situation, it will become worse. So apart from that, if you look at how the development happens, even the solutions. So cities trying to develop many solutions, but most of the solutions are either technology based or creating a physical infrastructure rather than looking at nature based solutions. But during last 4 or 5 years, even city has understood that the nature based solutions and even looking at water as one of the important aspects in the overall planning has become very critical, and they are also looking at nature based solutions. Even the disaster management department has upgraded its entire system, and they are looking at data as one of the important driver for decision making. The situation is changing, but it will take a lot of time given the density of the population, given the requirement, the availability of fund, which is again a major issue, because a lot of these adaptation related initiatives or measures are happening, which are driven by the central or state government scheme. Currently, there is very limited or almost nil private sector investment which is happening there. So whatever it is happening, it is through EPC contracts and all, but very limited investment happening through a privatization or a PPP mode. So that can be explored further, because the demand is huge, the requirement is huge, and the public funding available is very limited across India. So Mumbai is one of the better cities in India, which has a better finances, better balance sheet. So you can imagine the situation in other cities where the access to finance is not there. Even the capacity at the city level in terms of the municipal capacity is very limited. So there is a scope for convergence, looking at the central government or state government scheme, and also looking at different business models. So the existing business models which are adopted in Western countries or European countries, like municipal bonds, may be applicable to certain extent, but may not be applicable in Indian context. One need to look at the customization part of it, because many cities apart from Mumbai may not have that credibility in terms of the credit worthiness. So that also need to be looked at. So these are major challenges if you look at urbanization and cities like Mumbai in India. So the vulnerable societies, especially slums, and their role in informal economy is very critical. So one need to look at them very critically. Second is database decision making, as we are also highlighting in the at the start of the session, that database decision making is also very critical. I think that is the one area where private sector can also play a very important role, because the government role is changing from service provider to facilitator, but data is one of the area where actually both government and private sector can collaborate together, and they can create something like a data repository which can actually create avenues for the private sector and also for the government sector to improve their response to the adaptation and also disaster management. Because earlier it was thought that the climate change is not happening drastically, but over the last 5-6 years, we have seen that it is happening even in the inland cities of India as well, where there is a shorter period of rainfall, which is very intense, and also many industries are facing challenges. There is economic loss as well. So there is a business case where the industries or the corporates can come together to create a kind of a database and a repository which can be useful for the city as well as the government authorities for basically database decision making. So these are I think critical points when we look at urbanization, especially the Asian countries.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Mahesh. I believe the Mumbai probably encapsulates most of the challenges or the issues you could possibly think of, and it tends to show the extent of the scope task to be achieved. Even though Mumbai is probably among the best qualified and best equipped financially and technically to deal with those challenges in the Indian background. So a lot of interesting issues you raised, from data collection or curating to all the way to nature-based solution. We'll revisit those if we have time in the second part of the session. In the meantime, I'd like to turn to Jennifer to tell us more about what the most climate resilience issues have to do with water. We heard previous speakers in the keynote panel mention this, that climate change is first and foremost about water issues. What's your views on these water-related challenges, and maybe some of the aspects like nature-based solutions that were mentioned by Mahesh?
Sure, Francois, thank you. And I think Mahesh shows an excellent example of Mumbai encompassing so many challenges, but also so much opportunities, right, for such a significant city, really, globally, looking at the financial industry, but also at many other aspects. So when we look at water or climate resilience, I'm a strong believer that to be able to be resilient in the future, we actually have to be resilient today. Otherwise we're building on a very weak foundation. And if we look at water, we have extremely many water challenges, as Mahesh mentioned, already today. From people not having access to water, having vast amounts of water being lost in leaking pipes, having water sources being massively polluted, floods being, increasingly a problem because of building on floodplains and so on, deforestation, and all these different issues which are coming together to really make us at risk even today. And whenever we speak about climate resilience or climate change in general, I get the feeling we're looking only into the future, right? As if only the future was a problem for us, whereas we actually have huge problems today already. So for me, the solution to climate resilience really lies in the present moment of looking at what are the risks today, and how can we build ourselves to become more resilient today, to be able to then build on that foundation to become climate resilient in the future. And that applies for us as a world becoming more climate resilient, but also very much for projects like your investments. What is the status quo of the area you're investing in at the moment? Is it climate? Is it resilient in terms of water, but also in other aspects? And if not, this has to be fixed before you even look at climate change, because otherwise you're going to go in all different kind of directions. You don't really know 100% how climate change is going to play out in your local area. It's very difficult to predict it in a very localized context. And to give you an example, in Marshall Islands, we did a project proposal in which the project funder, I won't call names now, wanted to only finance for the climate resilient part, right? To improve access to water supply for the people on the island. So we had to make a model to show we need this additional amount of access to water and water supplies to be able to be climate resilient in the future. However, they even weren't climate resilient today. So the investment would have been quite in vain, because you're not really meeting, you're not really filling the gap, because you're building, your assumption is that everything is okay today, right? So your investment doesn't make as much sense as it would if you actually had water security today. So just to see the disconnect between many people focusing on investing in climate change adaptation, which actually don't have the biggest potential they could have, just because they don't look at the baseline of what's happening today. So what do we actually need? It's really holistic planning. Looking at what is happening today, but also looking across all different sectors: land use planning, urban planning, agriculture planning, water management planning. At the moment, they're all siloed, right? And then we just can't become a resilient society like that. And we really have to understand the underlying causes of risks to be able to find a solution to build a solid foundation. And one example I like giving is in Jakarta, in Indonesia, the capital of Indonesia. Some of you might know that Jakarta is one of the fastest sinking cities in the world, and it's mainly due to groundwater over abstraction. And we see people are abstracting groundwater, being households and industry. So the first reaction people are saying is we have to stop groundwater abstraction, right? But a better question to ask would be, why are people using groundwater? Is it just because they want to save money, or is it because they don't have any other sources? And you find is that the households actually do not have any connection to piped water. The only option they have is groundwater. So if you tell them the same with the industries, that they're not connected to the net. So if you were to, disconnect groundwater, which actually is impossible to do in this context, you would just disconnect a whole group of vulnerable people from water supply, which of course is not your intention, right? But it's like, limiting like the questions you have to ask to understand, right? So the solution would be to provide them with secure piped water from surface water to take the pressure away from groundwater, right? Because groundwater is a very important resource to build climate resilience for urban area or any area really. And then you can shift them away from using groundwater to actually using the piped water. So when looking at PPPs and around water utilities, for example, it would be really important to understand like what kind of water use behaviors do you people have who you want to supply? What are the actual challenges and how can you deal with them? Can you deal with them? Or would it become a financial nightmare for you once you move ahead? If I have time, I can give one more example, François. Yeah? Okay. So the other one would be, as Mahesh mentioned, the nature-based solutions. If we look at New York, for example, so you can really benefit, you can really use the potential of nature-based solutions to help, make a city more resilient, an area more resilient. In the case of New York, they actually had the choice between investing huge amounts of money to improving water treatment, or they could actually invest in upstream watershed management, forest management, which would then lead to naturally filtering the water and making water treatment actually unnecessary, at least, the biggest chunk of water treatment unnecessary. And by doing that, by using the nature-based solution, you have water treatment, of course, and you also have a natural flood protection upstream, because if you have a wetland, if you have forests, it actually retains the water in case of storm events, which are predicted to become more and more during climate change events, and it won't flood the city. And now actually New York is the catchment is the largest unfiltered water supply in the US, and it actually supplies 50% of the population of New York State, which is a huge amount of water which they are making available untreated, just through the benefit of nature-based solutions. So, just to conclude, I only have 8 minutes, to make a system water resilient, you really also have to look at water risks. And not only water risks in the future, but actually water risks today. Fix the problems today and then build on that to improve the future. And key to that is to understand the underlying causes and drivers. Like in the example of Jakarta I mentioned, you have to understand why are things happening, not just try to fix the problem you're seeing on the surface. And the best way of doing that is asking why as often as you can, like being a 3-year-old child again, ask why until you kind of come to the bottom and there's nothing you can ask anymore. And then that's the problem you actually have to fix. And then building from that, you can build a resilient solution.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. I think you very well illustrated the difficulty of interrelated issues and the need to take a comprehensive view, even for what would appear to be relatively simple issues like the level of water tables in the ground. And you have to have this sort of overall comprehensive view in order to be able to come up with the right sustainable solutions when it comes to devising and implementing sustainable infrastructure. And thanks for illustrating that with both examples from developing and developed world. Before we get to the second round of questions, which will focus more on financing issues, just wanted to display the results of the second poll that was circulated over the last minutes, which would be the how you see or how you rank the main issues from the public sector side in leveraging or mobilizing the required private sector resources and private sector input. So we have apparently a consensus that the first and foremost condition from the public sector side would be to come up with a clear policy framework and market signal by procuring authorities before we even get to more technical issues like institutional capacity or the lack of insufficiency of pipeline of investable projects. So on the other hand, regulatory or sectoral constraints are not viewed as major roadblocks limiting private sector involvement in resilient infrastructure projects. So that would provide a transition for me to switch to our more sort of a financially focused speakers today. And let me first turn to Munir. So Munir, drawing from the IFC and World Bank and more broadly multilaterals experience, there have been a number of recent reports covering this issue of climate adaptation and how to foster a higher level of investment, both from public and private sector side. What would be your views on what should or can be done in that respect from your standpoint?
Well, thank you very much, Francois. So let me just maybe divide my intervention into two parts. One, I would like to submit why investing in climate resilient PPPs or climate resilient projects is good business sense and good business case. And then I'll talk a little bit about what IFC and World Bank Group is doing to facilitate that. So for me, 4 reasons why do we need to do climate PPPs, apart from all the reasons that we discuss in terms of NDCs, in terms of 1.5% targets, etc. I think it's becoming a reality that the bankability and regulatory requirements will enforce more climate resilient PPPs, particularly after the creation of ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board, after COP26. Climate disclosures will be required from banks as well as investors. So that's reason number 1, the regulatory and the bankability requirements. The second one I would like to submit is actually economic and cheaper, perhaps, to do climate resilient PPPs, because you can then tap into the finance pool of sustainable financing, right? And this has been growing quite exponentially, both in terms of sustainability-linked loans as well as sustainable bonds. We've seen a tremendous increase, an exponential increase in terms of that's financing, which basically means that if you have a climate resilient PPP and you can tap into this financing, you will get a cheaper cost of financing. And this is still nascent in emerging markets, but I think the potential is quite significant over there. Number 3, in terms of the third reason why this is good business sense, is if you look at the life cycle costs of a PPP, you will see that if you invest in climate resilient PPPs or climate resilient projects, the overall cost reduces. Let me give you an example of that. A green building certification costs maybe 1 or 2% increase in terms of capex, but you can recover it in 2 to 6 years, right? And that's a pretty good a payback period. And it also helps in terms of getting cheaper financing, and also the NDCs, the country's NDC commitments. And fourth, I think investors are much more wary in terms of how these risks are allocated, particularly in the wake of the recent events. They want to see the climate-related risk appropriately mitigated, and if you mitigate this properly, you will get better pricing from the lenders as well as better offers from the investors. So for me, I think it makes not only absolute business sense, but actually it is a requirement of today to do climate resilient PPPs. Now, shifting the gears a little bit in terms of what IFC as a multilateral institution, or more broadly World Bank Group, is doing, I think we've made very, very ambitious commitments around climate action plan. First and foremost, from 2021 to 2025, we have publicly stated that 35% of our interventions will have climate finance, right? That's a pretty big number. And I think it goes even more after 2025, everything that we're going to finance will be screened for Paris alignment, and 100% of that will need to be Paris aligned from July 2025 onwards. So if that is a big pool, if that is something to go by, if World Bank Group is doing it, you can see that other multilaterals are also following suit. That's a big pool of capital in terms of infrastructure development. Second, something closer to home for me, which is the PPP transaction advisory business that I cover, is working with the governments in terms of incorporating climate considerations into the development of PPPs. And I would like to submit that we've actually been doing this even before Paris Accord, right? If I give you an example, back in 2011, we structured a project in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and one would say, this was very, very early days. This is Medina Airport project, and that project was LEED Gold certified because it had a green building, right? And sustainability features built into that. And I think this just shows that this is good business sense. I think we also incentivize governments in terms of looking at this more holistically in terms of the advice that we give. So let me give you 3 or 4 examples on that. First of all, on the renewable energy generation, which I think is going to be a big engine in terms of green energy. We have developed 2 platforms. One is called Scaling Solar. The other is called Scaling Wind, just to make sure that a lot more development of solar or renewable energy in general takes place. Secondly, we recently closed a project in Dakar, which is a BRT project in which 100% of the buses are e-vehicles, right? And then we've also built in bike lanes, making sure that we have car parks and making sure that we have landscaping to incentivize people to switch from personal vehicles into more public transport. Another example I'd like to give is we're advising on a project which is a schools project in Jordan. It's a typical PFI project, but it requires the buildings to be EDGE certified, so green buildings, plus it requires solar energy generation on rooftops. And then lastly, I want to give another example, which is in Belgrade. So I wanted to cover, a myriad of sectors as well as geographies. This is in Belgrade, where we did a waste to energy project in terms of methane capture. Methane is 25 times more potent than carbon dioxide. And this project allows 250,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year to be captured and generate 30 megawatts of renewable energy. All this to show that this is in our DNA in terms of doing more climate resilient PPPs. And then a couple of other things. I think in terms of capacity building, I've seen the World Bank has been doing a lot of awareness raising and capacity building, but particularly on the public sector. The recent World Bank Group Toolkit for Infrastructure PPPs, which was published in May last month, provide concrete solutions to public officials in terms of developing climate smart PPPs. The EDGE certification that we do on green buildings also provides a good business case in terms of how do you ensure that whilst you're increasing the capex a little bit, but your life cycle costs are low. And then lastly, I think we are also looking at a few other pilot approaches, such as nature-based solutions and carbon credits. So all this to say, just to conclude, one, I think climate finance and climate resilient PPPs, it's good, makes good business sense. You will see a lot more focus both in terms of regulatory and financing requirements. And secondly, we as World Bank Group are playing our role in terms of making sure that our interventions are climate aligned. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Munir. Again, a very extensive description of all the various initiatives undertaken by the World Bank Group. We may come back, if you want, later on during the Q&A session on how best to incorporate sustainability features when we know, and this has been a point that was touched upon in the previous panel, that most or a big part of the private investment allocated by institutional investors, for example, to infrastructure, would go more to existing sort of brownfield assets rather than greenfield, particularly in emerging markets. So how best to play that early incorporation or design the card when faced with this type of constraint. But in the meantime, I'd like to turn to Salim. So Salim, you're the representative of private infrastructure funds, both on a commercial basis and, as you briefly mentioned in your introduction, sort of developing new types of blended finance funds relying on sort of a philanthropic or public money to make some type of investments in sustainability feasible. So how would you, what's your views on how best to attract both conventional investors and maybe more fringe investors from the non-commercial sector to those sustainable infrastructure projects?
Thank you, Francois. Listening to the previous speakers, fascinating discussion. It seems to me that we're really looking at three different types of investment in resilience, in resilient and sustainable infrastructure. I guess the first category is how do we invest in resilient infrastructure that is ready to withstand the challenges raised by climate change. And I think Munir made the very powerful and convincing case that actually this is going to become absolutely necessary in the future for regulatory reasons, but also it's simply for good, simply to ensure that we have profitable infrastructure, if you look at it from an investor's perspective, and that actually addressing this effectively is a way to access cheaper sources of financing. The second type of I guess the second type of projects that we are facing are investments in climate mitigation. Now, this will typically be found in areas such as economic infrastructure and energy and transport, where it's really about how do we transition these sectors to net zero solutions so that we can effectively address the climate mitigation challenge. Now, I certainly wouldn't say that these are easy projects to develop, but because this is an economic infrastructure, there are economic flows involved that we can rely on to find funding solutions to make these projects financially and economically sustainable, and to get these sort of projects off the ground. And then there's the third category, which is arguably the most difficult one, which is pure climate adaptation. And this is very much defensive in nature. And this is about how do we find the appropriate sources of funding to fund what is essentially a new and very, very high investment requirement. So I think it's interesting to think of these things along these three categories. And as I mentioned before, we feel that cities are very much at the heart of this challenge. And despite clear demand for resilient infrastructure, we still see substantial headwinds on the ground to actually get these projects developed. I think the first, and it's been mentioned before, there's an issue around expertise and the ability of municipal sectors, of the municipal sector to have the right level of expertise to develop these projects, which is something very new. Even governments would struggle with many of these projects. So taking this now to the municipal level is an added level of difficulty. There's also an issue around access of capital for the municipal sector generally on a global basis. So developing the market for municipal finance, I think, is obviously an important challenge. In addition to creating the conditions where financial investors like ourselves, for example, are in a position to invest in projects in cities. And then there's an added level of complexity for urban projects, which comes from the fact that these projects are happening in dense urban environments and with a large number of stakeholders involved that need to be involved, and often also projects in cities tend to be smaller, and so there's an issue for these projects to access capital. There's an issue of how do we bundle the projects, how do we create aggregation mechanisms that can make it attractive and economical for investors to position themselves on such projects. Now, actually, the initiative that we were developing around urban resilience with Meridium aims precisely to address a number of these challenges. First, we have a clear mandate to focus exclusively on projects in cities. So municipal projects are not competing for our attention with larger, easier national level projects. And we also have a very clear mandate that we should step in and engage at an early stage with the municipal sector, and where it's relevant, support cities in the preparation and the development of projects so that they can bring these projects to market more effectively. And this is clearly the mandate that we have. Now, I want to reiterate the fact that I believe that investors have a very important role to play, and especially and not just for for economic infrastructure. I think if you look at the climate adaptation defensive agenda, I think here we know that this is where the funding challenge is greatest, and I think this is where the ability of investors to be creative and yet responsible in thinking and contributing ideas around new economic models of where we can find value that can help support these sort of these types of projects. I think that's where investors have a very important role to play, and not just any investors. I think it's very important that we encourage a special breed of investors, genuinely long-term investors. And not all investors are out there and have a mandate to create value over a 15, 20, 25, or even 30-year horizon. And that's just the way it is. But definitely, and I believe Munir also made this point, PPPs are a very valuable framework for forcing the stakeholders to think long-term, to think about the long-term cost of projects. But I think PPPs work best when this long-term framework is supported by long-term sponsors, long-term investors who are going to be there from day one all the way to the 20 and 25 or 30-year period. So, and certainly this very much the DNA of Meridium. We've been investing in infrastructure projects for almost 17 years now, and Meridium has never sold an asset. We raise our capital from long-term investors who are committed to staying in projects for the long haul. And you can see this in the way that we're looking at our assets, our own assets, the assets we've developed over the last 17 years. We're increasingly now, because we know we're going to be there for another 10, 15, 20 years. We are screening our existing asset base for climate risks and developing climate adaptation plans where that's relevant. So and finally, the last challenge that we were trying to address is the ability to bring, because if we're going to do this, it needs to be done on a massive scale. So the question is, how do you create the conditions where private investors are comfortable in going into what is effectively a new market, municipal resilience projects in cities around the world? So the fund that we're developing especially for non-OECD countries is a fund which has blended finance embedded inside it. So we've tried to create a fund where we have the blended finance structure that can make it comfortable for traditional institutional investors to invest directly in resilience and sustainable infrastructure in cities, in geographies and locations where they until now have probably not been comfortable investing.
Thank you, Salim. I believe, a very interesting sort of presentation on what can be done. Still a bit early to talk about a success story, since I understand Turf has just been launched some time ago, but certainly a very innovative way to try and attract conventional investors that may not or wouldn't have come otherwise into that type of sustainable projects targeting cities in emerging markets. So that is actually partly response to one of the questions in the chat. People wanted to hear about the blended finance and existing precedents or success stories in our experience. Maybe some of our panelists can add to that. But scaling solar, scaling wind were also mentioned as another innovative way to attract and leverage private capital. We should have by now the results of the third poll that was proposed to you on what are the areas of public support which are deemed most essential, critical to effectively incentivize and leverage private investment. So public support is definitely expected on the technical side to structure and develop projects that would be fit for private sector investment, and even more than that on the financial side. And that's where we again encounter this whole issue of blending public and private money to effectively respond to what could be seen as a market failure right now, the inability of the market to internalize externalities linked to sustainability or monetize non-financial socioeconomic issues that may make those projects, if left purely on the private side, not effectively taken up by private investors. So definitely a strong expectation on what the public sector ought to do to facilitate and push and speed up the process. And we've seen initially that we're still very, very far from the required level. So to speed up and scale up private sector involvement in resilient, sustainable PPP projects that respond to climate adaptation. There's one aspect, and we have just a few minutes left. One aspect that hasn't been, we didn't address so far, maybe on the interest of some kind of specific label or standard for these resilient PPPs. It's not just about ESG. There's this added dimension of adaptation and resilience, which some initiatives, I believe, has started to fully factor in. I'm thinking of fast infra, for example. But I'd like to ask our panelists whether they see a need in that respect to come up with maybe a more harmonized way of standardizing, labeling for those resilient PPPs. I don't know, Munir, maybe you'd like to comment on this. What's your views on what the market would expect to as sort of a market signal?
Thank you, Francois. So look, I think we are in such a nascent stage that every little helps.
We can't hear you.
Can you hear me now? Okay. All right. So look, I think we are in such a nascent stage that we need to start taking baby steps before we go towards the harmonization. At certain stage, we are already doing that. As I mentioned, that we have this EDGE certification, we have a climate toolkit. All these efforts are to standardize, an approach which we hope will become the mainstream from something which is not mainstream today. So I agree with you that we need to do that, but I think I would like to submit that we need to do this in baby steps and start building on it.
Okay. Well, thank you. I'm afraid we've reached the end of our allocated time slot. I'm sure there would be still a lot of issues or pent-up demands from our audience regarding this whole theme of how to design and build resilient PPPs. But we have to stick with the schedule. So let me thank, on your behalf, all our panelists for their contribution. I think they provided very interesting and enlightening perspectives from their various backgrounds. So thanks again, and invite you to move on to the next session. Thank you. Goodbye.